Good news from the World Bank. It says the number of people living in extreme poverty will fall below 10% this year. But it's also warning of major hurdles in the goal to end poverty by 2030. So can these trends continue? And can poverty be eradicated once and for all? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. We are the first generation in human history that can end extreme poverty. Those are the bold words from the head of the World Bank, whose latest statistics seem to be good news for the world's poorest citizens. The global development lender says this year, for the first time, the number of people living in extreme poverty is likely to fall below 10% of the world's population. The bank has lifted its extreme poverty line from $1.25 a day to $1.90. Even with that adjustment, extreme poverty, it says, has fallen by around a quarter in just the last 3 years. Well, the World Bank President Jim Yong Kim says the new forecast of poverty falling into the single digits should give us new momentum and help us focus even more clearly on the most effective strategies to end extreme poverty. It'll be extraordinarily hard, especially in a period of slower global growth, volatile financial markets, conflicts, high youth unemployment and the growing impact of climate change. But it remains within our grasp as long as our high aspirations are matched by country-led plans that help the still millions of people living in extreme poverty. So how is that poverty distributed around the world? Well, for the last few decades, 3 regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia, have accounted for 95% of global poverty. But concentration across the 3 regions has changed dramatically. In 1990, East Asia accounted for half of the global poor, with 15% in Sub-Saharan Africa. This year's forecasts show a complete reversal. It's Sub-Saharan Africa which now accounts for half of the global poor, whilst 12% are in East Asia. So plenty indeed to discuss, and let's bring in our guest today to do so. In Nairobi, Ali Khan Sachu, CEO of Rich Management and Emerging Economy Specialist. In Oxford, Deborah Hardoon, Deputy Head of Research on Poverty and Inequality at Oxfam. And in London, via Skype, Jan Randolph, Director of Sovereign Risk Analysis at IHS Global Insight. Great to have you all with us. Thanks very much for joining Inside Story. Deborah, if I could start with you, because we're looking at very impressive figures here. 200 million people lifted out of extreme poverty in just 3 years. How has this been achieved?
So it's really a great story, and it's not just been in the last 3 years. In the last couple of decades, we've seen the rates of people living in extreme poverty fall quite dramatically. So we were able to meet the Millennium Development Goal to halve the number of people living in extreme poverty. We were able to meet that 5 years early. Now, a lot of that has been to do with rapid economic growth, particularly in places like China, where people have been able to grow themselves above the extreme poverty line. But we've also seen a lot of progress around the world, and we've seen progress on other measures of poverty and development. We've seen maternal mortality rates fall. We've seen the proportion of children, especially girls, in education increase. So we've seen really quite a lot of progress over the last couple of decades. And what we really need is for this momentum to continue and go further so that we can reach this target to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. So it is possible, and we really just need to make sure that we overcome some of these final hurdles, of which there are quite a number to overcome if we're really going to do that by 2030.
Absolutely. We'll be looking a little bit more at the obstacles later in the programme. Jan, are you impressed with these news, these figures? Do they come as any surprise?
They're very impressive, and it's very good news. I think, yes, economic growth is certainly the main factor behind that. And clearly, China, the emergence of China on the global stage, tremendous influence in lifting people out of poverty. China has lifted more millions out of poverty than any other country in such a short space of time. And of course, Chinese growth means growth for other countries. But it's not just economic growth. We've heard a lot about China, a lot about emerging markets. one of the key factors is the role of women and infant mortality. Absolutely important here in lifting people out of extreme poverty. Infant mortality, if we can deal with infant mortality and lower infant mortality rates and educate women with basic public healthcare services, then we can do this final push, and it is last leg final push to lift people out of extreme poverty.
Ali, there in Nairobi, I mean, these statistics, as we've heard from our other two guests, are largely due to the growth of China, the growth of Asia, and indeed we did see in that map that we've seen the bulk of poverty shifting from Asia now to sub-Saharan Africa. Would you say that the picture there in Africa is rather less positive?
Absolutely. I think this is really a miraculous Chinese and a little bit Indian. That's what this story is about. If you dig into the statistics, it really is the incredible rise of China which is making these numbers look really good. If you look at Africa, notwithstanding some successes, Rwanda is a good example, Ghana is another good example, but it remains a very, very mixed bag when it comes to the continent. I think a lot of the upliftment in Africa was due to economic growth that we saw in the last decade, which is slowing down and really dramatically. And I'm concerned that without that serious economic tailwind in Africa, we could go sharply into reverse. I mean, China has one letterbox. It's a monolithic structure. You can make these tremendous gains if you've got a determination at the apex. Africa, much more complex, much more complicated, many more letterboxes. So yes, I think we've had this tremendous Africa rising narrative, but if you look at what's happened on the ground, we haven't seen enough traction. You get this famous quotation from people on the street, you can't eat GDP. Africa has not had a chance to eat its heightened GDP yet. So I am concerned about the continent.
Yeah, so one big issue, of course, is how to keep this momentum going, and I do want to return to that again just a little later in the programme. Deborah, for the moment, I just want to know what it's like on the ground, what it's like for someone to lift themselves out of extreme poverty. What does that look like?
Well, just to be clear, so the benchmark for living in extreme poverty is now calculated to be at about $1.90 per person per day. So this is the very, very minimum level of income that you need to meet your basic needs. So if you have less than $1.90 per day, you really struggle to feed your family, you struggle to stay healthy, you struggle to stay alive. So what we're talking about, although we're lauding the successes of reducing the proportion of people that are living below this very low benchmark, the fact that anyone does is really unacceptable. So it's a really kind of very low minimum standard of living, and it's a very low benchmark. There are obviously many other ways that we look at poverty and many other measures for poverty. The World Bank itself says that anyone below $10 a day, for example, is vulnerable. So even when you have $10 a day, that's still putting you in a very vulnerable situation should you have unexpected medical expenditures or something like that will put you in a very perilous situation.
OK, I think this is a good opportunity to take a bit more of a look at what Deborah was talking about there, what living below the poverty line actually means. And Al Jazeera's Fez Jamil reports now from New Delhi.
Crammed together, stacked haphazardly on top of each other. This is what many of India's urban poor call home. Saida's family struggles every day just to eat. She says corruption and bureaucracy mean her family doesn't get the ration cards or other benefits they're entitled to.
These are my kids, and they live like this. Today there's bread, but maybe tomorrow there's not. If we don't have work, where will the money come from?
With little outside help, this daily struggle has become a way of life for most people here.
This situation for the poor is common in many parts of the country, in both rural and urban areas. Even if the poor here met the World Bank's new poverty line measure of $1.90 a day, many here say it won't be enough for them to live on.
Even earning less than $2 a day is tough. Saida's husband, Iqbal, is well aware of his family's plight, but says there's not much he can do about it.
I don't have any work, so obviously we are poor. We are just managing to survive. Somehow I managed to get work to feed my children. I'm not trained or educated to go and get a proper job. All I can do is manual labor.
These are common complaints.
Poverty levels are increasing,
But it's made worse, according to those who work with the poor, by some basic services being privatized, driving up costs even further.
You have the poor having to access high-cost public services, be it in education, be it in hospitals, or be it in water. Therefore, that model is the reason why even if people get $2 a day, they are still poor because you can't access basic services, you can't get decent jobs.
Experts say India's rapid economic growth is another reason why artificial poverty lines don't reflect realities on the ground, where people are just trying to survive. Fez Jamil, Al Jazeera, New Delhi.
So, Yen, how is it that the World Bank has arrived at this global poverty line figure of $1